There are moments in history that mark a clear turning point, after which everything feels divided into a before and an after. Events like COVID-19, the 9/11 attacks, and the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, for instance. When you live them, somehow you understand immediately that they'll make it into the history books. When it comes to technology, many argue that such a turning point in recent history was the Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Well, this is one of the biggest scandals that we've seen in the business world for many years.
This is former Euronews journalist Guy Schoen analysing the scandal on the Euronews programme Talking Business, a few months after it was brought to light in March 2018.
This scandal drew together both the public, 2.2 billion of us have a Facebook account, but also politicians who were increasingly getting frustrated at the power that Facebook were wielding, and a sense that that power was being wielded in a sort of unchecked manner.
Cambridge Analytica was a political data firm principally owned by right-wing donor Robert Mercer. The company was hired by Donald Trump's 2016 election campaign to support data-driven voter targeting. In 2018, following investigations by major news outlets including the New York Times, The Observer, and The Guardian, Cambridge Analytica came under scrutiny for using data improperly obtained from Facebook to build voter profiles and influence the 2016 US presidential elections. Back in 2014, a Facebook quiz invited users to discover their personality type. The questionnaire was designed to collect data from both the person taking the test and their friends. This data was later sold to Cambridge Analytica. Christopher Wiley, a former employee of the firm, revealed that the company used personal information obtained without users' consent to build detailed voter profiles and target individuals with political messaging. Soon after the scandal erupted in 2018, Cambridge Analytica filed for bankruptcy and ceased operations. As for Facebook, its founder and owner Mark Zuckerberg acknowledged the mistakes of his company and announced changes to how third-party apps access user data.
We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry.
The story continued into 2022, when Facebook's parent company, Meta Platforms, agreed to pay $725 million to settle legal action over the data breach. The Cambridge Analytica scandal reshaped the relationship between users and social media platforms. It raised awareness on issues related to data privacy and showed how social media has the power to influence political and economic systems beyond the internet. A power that is often concentrated in the hands of a few firms, located in a limited number of regions whose rules of operation remain difficult to fully understand. Welcome to Euronews Tech Talks, the podcast that explores the digital, technological, and scientific landscape shaping Europe. I'm your host, James Thomas. Today we kick off our journey into the world of social media. Don't worry, we won't be diving into the typical debate of whether social media is good or bad. We assume that as listeners of this podcast, you already know the pros and cons. Instead, over the next 3 episodes, we'll try to better understand the tools we use every day, how they work, how they're regulated, and what we can and can't do on those platforms. To do so, as always, we'll speak with experts from across the continent. In this episode, we'll specifically look at what a social media platform truly is, and ask ourselves whether there are any viable alternatives to the most well-known mainstream ones. So grab yourself a cup of tea and let's begin. I still remember the first time I used a social network. I was 12, and as a regular millennial kid, I had one big dream: to get on MSN Messenger. If you were born after the 90s, chances are you're not familiar with it, and that makes me feel old. MSN, short for Microsoft Network, was an internet messaging service through which you could chat with your friends in real time. In a way, it was fairly similar to WhatsApp. When my parents finally allowed me to get MSN, I was so excited. Finally, I could talk to my school friends as soon as I got home, even though I'd just spent about 7 hours with them at school and had said goodbye to them only about an hour before. Since then, in one way or another, I've always been connected to one or multiple social networks and media platforms. I keep in contact with my long-distance friends on Instagram, share my job updates on LinkedIn, watch funny videos on TikTok, and as a fact-checking journalist, look for fake news to debunk on X. And of course, I'm not the only one. In 2025, almost 70% of Europeans reported using socials. These tools play an important role in our society and in our private lives, but somehow there are many things we don't know about them, including very basic aspects.
There's a difference between a social networking site and a social media platform.
This is Michael Bossetta, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University in Sweden.
The difference between a site and a platform is really the role of algorithm. Algorithms work to coordinate communication, and they set the rules for how communication happens on a social media, whereas a social networking site, as many of these platforms were in the early days, is really just facilitating communication between people. So you don't really need an algorithm there.
This first definition is fairly easy to understand. Social networking sites focus on building connections between people, while social media platforms are also about content discovery via algorithms.
The way that we're thinking about social media today started around 2007, and that's when Facebook made the shift from becoming a social networking site to a social media platform. That's when it opened up the ability for various types of other softwares to come in and build on top of the app. And that sounds technical, but I'll give you an example. You may be asked to connect, for example, your Spotify account to Facebook. And what that does is that it allows for data to be transferred from Spotify to Facebook and from Facebook to Spotify. And that's really a technical change from how these sites used to work before 2007 to how they've been working afterwards. And so if we think about the types of social media today and the role they have in society, it really changed between that move from a site to a platform.
Facebook, or as it was originally called, The Facebook, was launched by Mark Zuckerberg in February 2004. Back then, Zuckerberg was a psychology student at Harvard University in the US, and he was very much into computer programming. Initially, Facebook was exclusively targeted at Harvard students. It was later extended to Boston universities, then US universities, then US high schools, and finally to users worldwide. As of today, Zuckerberg is one of the richest people in the world. And Facebook is now part of Meta, a parent company which also includes Instagram, WhatsApp, Threads, and Messenger, one of the largest and most influential tech firms globally. Facebook and other mainstream social media platforms share many similarities. As we mentioned before, they're used not only for connecting people, but also for sharing content. They require users to have an account and have become essential parts of many people's lives.
They coordinate so many different types of information and communication in our lives, right? Email does that to some extent. It does that for work. But social media coordinates all sorts of things from networking with our friends to entertainment to commerce and things that we want to buy. And so these social media platforms are really sort of Swiss Army knives or one-stop shops for all sorts of social needs that we have as human beings.
But major social media platforms also share another aspect. They're built as closed-source software.
Closed source means that we don't know what is the technical operations underneath the platform. We don't know how it's working. And most social media platforms are closed because that is their business secret. That is their secret sauce for how they work. Whereas open source platforms are basically saying, you can copy this and use it how you'd like. So if Facebook was open source, someone could just copy the code and then create another Facebook. And that's obviously not good for Facebook's business model. So most social media platforms are closed because how they work is a business secret. It's their competitive advantage.
We don't know much about how Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok work. Their algorithms are secret. But this is different for open source platforms. An example of them is Mastodon, a non-profit and a European alternative to X. Mastodon was founded in 2016 by software developer Eugene Roshko. Anyone can download, modify, and install Mastodon on their server, and its code is open source. In addition, Mastodon is built on a decentralized model. While on X, Facebook, and Instagram, all users' interactions and content are managed by a single company, Mastodon operates through a distributed network of servers, where each server is an independent entity. But of course, open source platforms face some difficulties. Here's Michael Bossetta again.
So there are platforms like Mastodon where you can sort of copy the code and run your own little social network. But the problem is that the user experience on these open source platforms is just not close to how major platforms like TikTok and Facebook operate. It's just not fun from a user perspective.
Open source and decentralized social media represent an alternative to mainstream platforms. It's true, though, that they aren't necessarily better than the platforms most users are familiar with. For instance, it's often more difficult to implement moderation and regulation in decentralized networks. However, they aim to challenge the near monopoly on users' attention held by large tech companies. Because yes, this dominance is real and not merely a perception. For example, in November 2025, Meta's Facebook held more than 80% of the social media market in Europe, followed by Instagram and X. These corporations are not only large, but they're also based in the United States, which further reinforces the concentration of power. But some European platforms, like the aforementioned Mastodon and the recently created Monet, are trying to change this trend. This is Christos Floros, founder of Monet Social.
Before I started this company, I was working in social media analytics, and I was seeing daily just how much we're influenced by social media and how the experiences that we have online are so curated, personalized. The algorithms dictate how people feel about themselves. The algorithms dictate how people feel about each other. The algorithms dictate our democracies. They dictate our societies. They dictate. The algorithms have become our dictators. And we need to build alternative social platforms that enable people to have agency again. And that's how it started.
Based in Luxembourg, Floros registered Monet Social in June 2025. His app is similar to Instagram, but it seems to take a step back to the social networking era.
The main promise that we make is that there's no algorithm. Recommendations only exist on a separate page where you have full control over what you see, and they're still chronological. The idea is that when you sign up, you just see your friends. You see the people you follow. So we're taking agency away from the algorithm and giving agency to the person. If you say I follow someone, it means because I want to connect with that someone.
Given this important structural difference, Monet is built on a different business plan than mainstream social media platforms like Instagram.
We're building a membership type of application where you pay, where you say, my social platform is the equivalent of my cafe down the street. My social platform is the equivalent of the bar that I go to hang out with my friends. And our goal is to make it cheaper than a price of coffee every month for you to go and visit that social platform. But it's really important for us that we do not try to keep you hooked on the platform. You go to the platform to see your friends.
And it also has a different policy when it comes to AI.
Of course, we don't want AI-generated content, and we also don't want to feed people's content into AI for moderation. So our goal is to have human moderation on the platform. Our goal is to ensure that people's privacy is always protected. So the idea is that we collect as little data as possible, and none of that data is fed into AI.
According to Floros, Monet isn't only a business project or a way to rethink people's relations to social media. Monet is also a first step into building a European social media ecosystem.
The fact that we rely on this civic infrastructure that is not owned by us is probably cognitive warfare. And Europe has no layer of defense against cognitive warfare because the most we can do is regulate at the moment and maybe put some fines on platforms that don't follow our rules. We need homegrown platforms. We need values that reflect our shared European values. And truly, very much so, in the same way that social networks really benefited part of American society, in the same way that Hollywood benefited American society in terms of creating these narratives, creating a sense of identity, a shared cultural identity. We need these in Europe.
And Christos Flores is not the only entrepreneur working in this direction. The Danish NGO Rebuild, which counts former European Commissioner Margrethe Vestager as a patron, is trying to support this leap, connecting entrepreneurs with investors in the sector.
The momentum is building. We're still at the beginning, but the momentum is building.
But will Made in Europe social media platforms really make the social media sector a better place? It's certainly up for debate. On the one hand, some people like Michael Bossetta are skeptical.
I think that most of these American companies are under the legal regime of the United States and specifically California, but the companies or the workforce of these companies is very international. These are global companies. They involve many Europeans and non-Europeans in their workforce. I think the bigger risk is not to Europe or any particular country. It's to our civilization as a whole, because we have very, very talented, well-paid people who are spending their lives trying to get a couple extra seconds of you on your phone, rather than working towards solving some of the biggest challenges we face as a species, things like climate change, things like poverty, things like water shortages. Instead, we have our best and brightest trying to engineer more time for you to waste on your phone. And I think that is the risk, not to any particular country or polity.
On the other hand, people like Sandra Wachter, Professor of Technology and Regulation at the University of Oxford and at the Hasso-Plattner Institute in Potsdam, are more optimistic.
The power is not necessarily where technology is being developed, it's where it's being implemented and where it's being bought. And so that means that if other products were to open up, people might just migrate there and offer that. So if alternatives would pop up, then this could be like a unique point for other competitors to come into the market, which is one of the reasons why we have this Digital Markets Act, which is trying to revive healthy competition and make it easier for other competitors to enter the market. Because at the moment, we are very much in an almost monopolistic situation.
The Digital Markets Act is one of the multiple EU regulations aiming at limiting the power of big social media platforms and, more generally, big tech firms. This law entered into force in November 2022 and has recently been used by the European Commission to impose fines of 500 million euros on Apple and 200 million euros on Meta. According to the Commission, Apple breached the DMA by preventing developers from freely communicating with consumers and steering them to alternative channels outside its App Store for cheaper deals. While Meta's pay or consent advertising model, according to the Commission, failed to comply with the DMA by violating the rules on the use of personal data. The Digital Marketing Act is not the only regulation shaped by the EU.
We have the Digital Services Act that focuses more on platforms and search engines. So when you're interacting, for example, with Google, or you go on TikTok or on Twitter, then there are certain obligations that those platforms have in order to keep that environment safe.
The Digital Services Act, then, is more focused on the content published on the platforms. Is it illegal or harmful? How can we make platforms safer?
The best way to think about that whole framework is that those companies usually enjoy a liability privilege. So that means that they're not necessarily responsible to what's happening on their platform unless it is illegal and unless they know about it. So you can imagine it a little bit like a landlord that is renting out a flat, and you given the flat to the tenant and you say, don't do anything illegal. I'm not going to check on you on a daily basis, but if you do something illegal, I'm going to kick you out. And that similar system with the That same system applies for social media platforms as well. So Twitter and TikTok and so forth, they don't have to monitor their users all the time. That's not what they need to do. But if they find out that something illegal is happening on their platform, then they have to act. So that means you have to take the content down, for example.
These regulations aren't perfect, and their implementation isn't easy as it relies on effective enforcement across EU member states. But according to Sandra Wachter, it's a good first step.
Whenever there's a law, there's often also some criticism attached to it, but there are also a lot of people that value this regulation a lot. So a lot of civil society organization, NGOs, who would say this is a very great step forward in terms of protecting the data of people, human rights, stabilizing the economy and securities. Those are all things that would usually be valued. Very often we hear, of course, industry moaning a little bit about that type of regulation. I think that is very often mentioned by them, at least, is that they think that it's over-regulating and it's burdening them too much. And there are too many hurdles that they need to overcome, and this would stifle innovation. But this is an ongoing dialogue that we always have. Every time a new law comes into force, that those who need to do something are not often very excited to have new obligations that they need to follow. But on the other hand, I personally think, are those laws perfect? No, absolutely not. Are we better off having those imperfect laws? Yes, absolutely.
Tech giants might be scary, and you might even be wondering whether fining them can actually lead to any substantial change, considering the power they hold. We put that question to Sandra Wachter.
I think we don't have to fall into the trap of this too big to fail narrative and to see them as demigods and tech giants whose power cannot be yielded anymore. I think that's a popular narrative that plays into their hands, but in reality, nobody is really above the law. And I think the regulations that we have, if you applied them, they would work. They could be very powerful. It's just a matter of, let's say, the willingness of regulators or authorities to actually execute those laws as well.
That's all for today's episode of Euronews Tech Talks. We hope you enjoyed our first deep dive into the world of social media. Remember, we're not here to tell you to abandon them or to switch to other platforms. We're here to zoom in and out on certain aspects to better understand how these platforms work. We hope you enjoyed this episode and invite you to tune in 2 weeks. We'll have a debate on whether it's a good or bad thing to ban social media for children. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, James Thomas. This series was created by Marta Rodriguez Martinez. This episode was written and produced by Alice Carnevali. The theme music is by Leo Lebrun. Sound editing and sound mixing is by Joanne Breton. Our editor-in-chief is Niaz Samedizada. If you aren't already, you can listen to this series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castbox, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're enjoying the podcast, please consider leaving us a positive review and, of course, sharing it. Thanks for listening.